Good morning or good afternoon for the colleagues and the participants either in Europe or in Beijing. Greetings from the China-CEE Institute. For this year, from the autumn, the China-CEE Institute had initiated a new series of lectures hosted by the scholars from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Today, we have the honor to invite Professor Cai Fang to have the first lecture. Professor Cai Fang is the chief expert of the national think tank of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and as well as he is the academician and member of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He is also a member of the steering committee and vice chairman of the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee of the 13th National People's Congress of China. He's a famous economist, and he's in China and as well as in the world. His research interests focus on China's economic reform and development, also concentrating on the population economics, labor economics, and poverty. His recent publications include Demystifying the Economic Growth in Transition China, and China's economic development and its implication for the world. So here is my short introduction. And now we have the honor to invite Professor Cai Fang to have his speech. His topic is mainly on the Chinese new era, on the new stage of the economic development. And today, Professor Cai Fang, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Professor Chen Xin. Good afternoon, good morning. As I understand, it's the morning in Europe. Thank you very much for inviting me to give the lecture. I'm very delighted to share some of my research findings, particularly on the challenges facing China to sustain its economic growth in the future, certainly to secure its social stability. So first of all, let me, I think if you allow me, I'd like to first give something like 40 minutes talk, and then I'd like to hear questions or your comments. First of all, let me give a short introduction to my talk. As you know, from this year, we start the new plan, 5-year plan period. And for this 5-year plan, the central government also laid out the goal for both the next 5 years and the next 15 years. That is, we have the goals for the next 15 years until 2035. Basically, the new plan has, let's say, 4 new rhetorics. First, the Chinese economy enters new phase of its development. That is the completion of the building a well-being society. By 2020, we started to new course to build the modernization. That is from this year until 2050. Second is the new goals of development set by the central government. That is, China will to become high-income country by 2025 and a middle high-income country by 2030. 2035. The third new is the new principle of development. That is, the Chinese economy has to implement the new principle of development to an innovative, coordinative, open, shared, green, and secure the development in the new course of development. My talk will try to answer the following questions. First, how can population trend in China impact the economic growth sustainability? Second one is, how will the economic growth meet the goals set by the 14th five-year plan and the 2035 long-run goal? The third is, what role will the proposal of common prosperity play in tackling the challenges facing China? The last one is, what reforms should carry out to gain reform dividend, that is to increase the productivity and the growth rate. First, let me talk about a little bit about the demographic transition. In general, there are two turning points or two phases which are important in terms of the impact on economic growth. In China, we already passed the one turning point of demographic transition. That is in 2010, the Chinese working age population aged between 15 and 59 years old peaked. Afterwards, this group of population declined over time, so which led to supply side shocks on the economic growth. That is the slowdown economic growth in China. Next, we will have the second turning point of population. That is in about, actually before 2025, the total population will peak. That will, I believe, lead to demand side shocks on China's economic growth. So let us see the growth, how the growth potential versus growth actual. The first turning point, since that one, the labor, there have been labor shortage and a slower improvement of human capital, diminishing return to physical capital, and the slowdown of productivity growth, which all led to supply growth potential declining. That's the first one. But in the past years, I mean, in the period between 2010 and until now, the demand side factors actually perfectly met the supply side growth rate. That is, the potential growth rate is about the same as the actual growth rate. But if the second turning point comes, we will have trouble with demand side factors. That is, demand side factors will be the main constraint of the Chinese economic growth in the years to come. Secondly, let me talk a little bit about the goals in terms of per capita GDP set by the 14th five-year plan and the 2035 long-term goal. Basically, we have two period goals. First, the officially announced task for the Chinese economic growth is to enter high income group in 2025. We use the criterion by the World Bank grouping between the low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income. China currently, we have a per capita GDP over 10,000 US dollars. By 2025, the per capita GDP in China is supposed to reach or beyond the threshold of high income group of countries. That is 10,025 US dollars. And for the year 2035, we are supposed to become in the middle group of high income countries. That is 23,000 US dollars. So to realize those goals, both supply side and demand side efforts should be made in terms of sustained economic growth by both sides. And what major challenges we are facing now? Let us see the chart. The first one is you can see the working age population has been declining over time since 2010. That is, we have a labor shortage problem that increase the cost of labor. So diminishing, weakening the comparative advantage of manufacturing in China. Second, you can see the total capital increment every year. The person plus the years of schooling, we have the total human capital increment is declining over time. And also the return to capital investment is declining over time. And the total factor productivity growth is declining over time. And in the very recent years, the total factor productivity growth is actually negative. All these things have to be tackled, dealt with in order to sustain the potential of the growth. So that is, we have to remove all the barriers deterring labor move across sectors, across regions. Secondly, we have to provide equal opportunities for education and training in order to continue to increase human capital. And then we have to reform investment system, financing system to stop diminishing return. And then we have to allow entry, exit, and survival death of enterprises. That is a creative destruction in order to increase productivity. Otherwise, we cannot fully taking advantage of these growth potentials. And there is an even greater challenge in terms of demand side factors. You can see from this chart in the past over 20 years, all the demand side factors, that is the export, domestic investment or capital formation, or domestic consumptions, particularly household consumption, all have been declining. That is particularly before the year 2025, when the Chinese population peak, we will have a more strict constraint from demand side. So we have to cope with those challenges. So the common prosperity proposal is to tackle those challenges, particularly in terms of the demand side factors. We can see the common prosperity is both the objective of the Chinese modernization and also the countermeasures to tackle the challenges I just mentioned. Let me identify a few points of the proposal of common prosperity. First of all, this policy is both the objective and means. First of all, we have to share the economic development and social development results in long run. That is the objective of the Chinese modernization. Secondly, we have to use this as countermeasures in order to expand household consumptions in short run to cope with the demand side constraint. The third one is we have to skillfully respond to social concerns, because the income inequality and the wealth inequality have been widened dramatically in the past years. So the social concern is radical. The government has to respond to these concerns. Then we should make the pie bigger in order to distribute the pie fairly. So that's why the high quality development is considered as a prerequisite of common prosperity. Finally, the central government proposed the three domains of distribution. First is the primary distribution. Second distribution is the so-called redistribution. The tertiary distribution in China refers to the charities and widely social responsibilities and voluntary works, things like that. Let me talk about each of the domains of distribution. First of all, the primary distribution, that is to raise income of the Chinese households. You can see from this chart, in the entire period of the economic reform and the opening up, the household income growth basically is in tandem with the GDP growth, but in different periods it's different. In some periods, the GDP growth is far more quicker than the growth of household income. So in the past 10 years, however, the two growths have been in tandem perfectly. If we can continue the momentum in the past years, we will get the household income increased in the same pace with the per capita GDP. So that will be the major task in the primary distribution areas. So with the primary distribution, I mean, this distribution will play a major role in distributing income. So we will continue to use the market as the determined mechanism to allocate resources and factors. There is a very particular area in which the reform can make a big difference. Maybe some of you know, in China, we have the household registration system. We call it the hukou system that separates labor force and the residents between rural and urban areas. Currently, massive migrant workers moved from rural areas to urban areas. But as long as they don't get local urban hukou, the identity in urban areas, they are not equally treated in terms of the access to basic public services. And therefore, they cannot equally contribute. Actually, they contribute a great deal to labor supply, to the GDP growth, but sometimes they cannot equally contribute to the consumption that is more and more important to the GDP growth. So hukou reform will gain reform dividend great deal to the economic growth in China. And redistribution is also important now, is in a top priority of the agenda. Because from this chart, you can see in the past years, both the rural-urban income ratio declined and the Gini coefficient declined, but is still quite high internationally compared. So that is, if we just rely on the primary distribution, we cannot perfectly put Gini coefficient below 0.4. That's considered a relatively fair distribution. So the lessons from OECD countries, Gini coefficient reduces by 35% after redistribution through taxation and the transfer payment. So that's why the Chinese proposal gave a higher priority to the redistribution. The redistribution in China, I think, is very is both there have some commonality and some difference between Chinese version and the European version of the secondary distribution. I believe there are Chinese versions of the pattern of cradle to grave European patterns. That is, the central government identified 7 areas as basic public services that are required to cover everybody in China, both in rural and urban areas. They include the raising children, give them better care, and provide equal opportunities of education for the youth, and provide decent payment to the workers, and Medicares, and elderly support system and subsidize the housing to the ordinary household and assistance to the poor and the vulnerable. So particularly from this chart, you can see currently we have higher and higher proportion of elderly. That is, the Chinese population is aging. So we have to give more focus on providing support to the elderly. The tertiary distribution in China, I don't know if this is Chinese term or universally used. Anyway, in China, we consider tertiary distribution is the donation, the charity. So, but I believe that's more than just a percentage of the income of the rich. I think it refers, but not limited to charity and voluntary activities, particularly for the big firms. It involves with a range of social responsibility. Here, from this chart, you can see in China, each person every day spent over 300 minutes on paid jobs, while they spent about 160 something minutes to the unpaid jobs. So the unpaid jobs do not produce domestic gross domestic products. It doesn't generate the GDPs, but it's heavy. So if the firms have social responsibility, they have to cut the excessive overtimes. You see the 996 phenomenon in China is workers usually, in many firms, workers work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every week, 6 days. So that prevents them from shopping, consuming, being trained, finding good jobs, raising and educating children. So therefore, the fertility rate is extremely low compared to the development level of China. So the firms can do much more than charity or things like that. So the conclusion, I think I come to the conclusion. First of all, to realize its goal set for 2025 and 2035, China will have to tackle a variety of challenges from both supply side and demand side, particularly demand side, given the Chinese population will peak in just a few years. Secondly, the 14th five-year plan and the 2035 long-run goal proposed both reforms and various programs that will increase potential growth rate and share the results of development more equally in order to expand domestic demand. That is what the five-year plan proposed. So I think I stop here and I can have more time to communicate with your people. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cai. Thank you for your excellent lecture on the latest development of the China's economy especially focusing on, so we're entering into a new stage with a new pattern and facing with the new challenging situation. So very interesting topic. Also you mentioned on the common prosperity. I think it is a very important topic nowadays in the Chinese academia. So thank you again for your excellent speech. I think here we still have some time to have some question and answers interactions. So dear audience, please, if you have questions, please write your questions at the chat column, and we will ask or invite Professor Tsai try to answer the questions for today's lecture. Also, I would like to call your attention that China is a hot topic today. There are a lot of questions and topics, and I think our topic is mainly on the challenges, especially Chinese economic development. So these are the my suggestion. We concentrate on these topics. So here I already have a question from our Polish colleague, Professor Bogdan Korajczyk. He is also the member of the International Academic Committee of the China-CEE Institute. And his question is for Professor Tsai, that what is the meaning of dual circulation model? Professor Tsai.
Mean what?
Dual circulation.
Dual circulation model, yeah.
Yeah.
What is the meaning?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, you know, for many years in China's reform period, we had implemented the international circulation model. That is, the economic growth had been very outlooked, so export oriented. Even though the net export contributed relatively moderate share to the GDP growth, but the route export have been big. The international trade dependency in China had been quite high. So, but as you know, since first of all, we have two concerns from both international and the domestic changes. In international speaking, you know, since the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, the world economy has been in so-called circular stagnation. That is, the growth rate has been quite low, and inflation rate is low, and the interest rate is low. GDP growth is low. So the weakened world economy constrained the export from China. So that is China have to shift more to domestic demand. That's the first changes. The second change is, as I mentioned, the demographic transition indicates that the demographic dividend in China has been gone, or at least is gradually vanished. So the comparative advantage in manufacturing, which is a major export of the Chinese product, is weakening. So therefore, the export will not be as strong as the previous. After this pandemic, you can see the supply chain is tend to be decoupled from many countries concerned. Therefore, we have to shift the growth models of the Chinese economy from more international reliant, more export oriented pattern to the dual circulation. That is international circulation and the domestic circulation with more focus on domestic circulation. That is more focus on domestic investment and domestic consumptions, particularly the household consumptions.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Tsai. And there is also a follow-up question regarding on the dual circulation. So the question is from our Hungarian colleague. He is asking what is the relation between the dual circulation and the common prosperity, whether there is some linkage.
Okay, I think that's you got the point. When we shift our growth pattern to more domestic demand reliance, there are problems. First of all, the contribution of capital formation to GDP, that is the contribution of investment to GDP, has been extremely high. Our investment rate has been extremely high in China comparing to many other countries. I believe most of other countries, both either you compare to developing countries and to developed countries. So that is, we also have a task to rebalance the domestic demands. That is, we have to gradually lower the share of the contribution of investment to GDP growth. So that is the consumption, domestic consumption, particularly household consumption, is much more important. But China is still a country, developing country. We have only per capita GDP over 10,000 US dollars. So many people are still low income people. Particularly last year, we just announced that we eliminate all absolute poverty in rural areas based on relatively low criteria. That is 2.3 US dollars in PPP terms per day. So that's higher than the international poverty line, but still quite low. So China people are still poor. So if you, that's one. Secondly, China people is aging. The older people have relatively lower income because they don't have labor income anymore. The pension level is relatively low, and the access to pension coverage is not equally distributed between rural and urban areas. Many elderly people can only receive very low pension. So that's another concern. Then we also have a problem with the income inequality, because as you know, the marginal consumption tendency for the poor people is high, but the poor people tend to consume less. If you have a high inequality, you will have a weak consumption. So all these things determined that the central government have to deal with, first of all, to increase the per capita income for rural and urban Chinese. Secondly, we have to redistribute more fairly the income among different groups of people in order to let them have ability to consume, in order to support the demand factors. That is the key of the dual circulation.
Thank you, Professor Cai. Also, today there are lot of questions regarding on the common prosperity, and several participants had already raised a question on what is the relationship between the common prosperity and the entrepreneurship. So the enterprises, how to encourage the enterprises to provide or make more contribution for the economic development as well as for the common prosperity. They would like to.
Okay, I think that question is also concerned by many Chinese people, particularly the entrepreneurs. First of all, I have to say common prosperity is not a totally new rhetoric proposed recently. If you read the important documents of the Central Party in the past 40 years, you can see from the very beginning, from the time Mr. Deng Xiaoping initiated the reform, he used the concept of common prosperity. Secondly, in the very important documents of the party in 1992, the 14th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, which first announced that the Chinese reform is to build the socialist market economy. In that document, common prosperity is also mentioned. Particularly in the past more than 10 years, is frequently talked by the central leadership. So that's nothing new. Secondly, I believe since the common prosperity is supposed to reach through 3 domains of distribution, the primary distribution is still based on the market allocation mechanism. That is, a market mechanism will play primary role in distribution. So the market mechanism guarantees the incentives and motivations and efficiency that the entrepreneurs concerned the most. I think that's very important as for sure. And then the redistribution is the inherent role of the government, as international data show that as the country moved from a per capita GDP of 10 US dollars to per capita GDP of $23,000. The government expenditure on public services as a percentage of GDP will increase from 26% to 36%, 10 percentage points increase. That is, in the next 5 years, China will be in the same period. So I believe redistribution enhancement will just follow the common law, international law. And the tertiary, tertiary distribution is, voluntary, but we should, give more caution to the entrepreneurs to take their responsibility socially. So I think that is the basic institutions are not changed. So there is no conflict between the incentives, innovations, efficiencies, and common prosperities.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Cai. And I think it's time for the last question. Here, some participants raised the question regarding on the linkage between the new pattern of the Chinese economic development and the innovation society, and as well as globalization. So the linkage between the new pattern and the globalization, as well as the innovation society.
I think the new development pattern is the so-called dual circulation. So first of all, as I said, we previously, before we proposed the dual circulation pattern, China's economic growth pattern was a more export-led pattern. So now we gave we will take advantage of the two circulations. So nothing ignoring the international circulation or globalization. But, the globalization is weakening. First of all, since 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, many countries tend to implement policies, more populism, more nationalism, more protectionist, things like that. And secondly, after this pandemic, the supply chain tend to be decoupled. Many countries tend to deliberately decouple the supply chains from some other countries. Maybe some concerns with the security of supply, some concerns maybe more polygeography. So, but anyway, I think the globalization, particularly economic globalization, is irreversible, certainly. But for some period, I believe it will be relatively weak. In that case, China, as many other countries, will have to have our precaution for rainy days. So therefore, we are in the new stage in which the Chinese people will become richer and richer. Secondly, we need to implement the new pattern to take advantage of both international and domestic circulations.
Thank you, Professor Tsai. Thank you for your very insightful knowledge, and as well as for your time and patience for the questions. And I would like to say that there are still a lot of questions, not only regarding on today's topic, the Chinese economic development, but as well as the other very hot topics like the Belt Road Initiative, China-EU relations, China-US relations, how is about the future of the China-EU comprehensive investment agreement, etc. So these questions, I think, are far beyond today's topic, and the China-CEE Institute will have more lectures in this year, and some of them are already touch upon these topics. So dear participants, please keep informed and keep updated about our future lecture series. Thank you again for all your participation. And final thanks to Professor Tsai. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.